with Haviv Rettig Gur of the Times of Israel, and I'm taping it an hour before my program goes live so that I don't have to interrupt Haviv up and down, and I'll spool it out throughout the show today. But it's an important day. Prime Minister Netanyahu sitting down with President Trump, and I wanted to talk with Haviv. Haviv, welcome back. Good to see you again and to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, Haviv, you are 43 years old. I want to talk to you about five old men. And I want to start with, and maybe spend 10 minutes on each of them. I just want to know what you, Haviv Rettig Gur, think about each of these men as Israel faces big choices. The first one, Gadi Moses, is just an incredible inspiration to me. He is one of the hostages who was just released. He's 80 years old. I learned that he was born near Haifa before the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, was even founded. He's an expert in wastewater management and field crops. He was a peace activist, and he went toe-to-toe with the terrorists for all these 16 months. What does he mean to you?
He walked several miles every day in his cell. And he wasn't back a few days before he went back to the fields. And he went back to, talking with the farmers and talking about rebuilding the tremendous agriculture that he was part of before October 7th. So yeah, there's a generation of Israelis, the political leaders of that generation, people like Rabin, who built a country with their bare hands, who were born in a world during, that saw World War II, that saw a Holocaust, that saw weak Jews, and built a world that's completely radically different. He is of that generation, and they are a generation made of steel.
All of the hostages who've emerged have amazing stories. Some have been brutalized more than others. But for an 80-year-old man to walk out, I am reminded of great dissident literature, whether it's Solzhenitsyn or Bukowski, whether it's the fellow from Cuba whose name I'm blanking on already, Armando Valladares. Is he going to write something, or is he just going to go back to being on the kibbutz?
That's I don't know, the old classic century old kibbutz ideal is the farmer who can quote Schopenhauer, right? So these are well educated people. They work the land because they believe in working the land. They love, that's who they are. In other words, it's not that they're uneducated. Maybe he'll write a fantastic book. I have to tell you, I once worked, one of the highlights of my life and career was working for Natan Sharansky,
Ah,
who is a great dissident who sat in the Soviet gulag for years and was in solitary confinement. And then, as he is being released, 19, I think it was 1986, the Soviet officer told him, walk straight across the bridge to the other side, where he was going to be whisked away to America and be free. And because the Soviets told him to walk across the bridge straight, he walked zigzag. The very last thing that a Soviet officer told him to do, he refused to do. These are unbroken people. I, in my, finest moments of, would like to imagine that it's in all of us. But when you meet them who've gone through it and who've found that iron inside themselves and really know what they are made of, it's an astonishing thing.
now, Mr. Sharansky, it was one of my honors to ever share a stage with him at the Reagan Library. We did an event some years ago, and I know he was honored by commentary this year. He is in that category of people who inspire, no matter who you are or what your background is. There are also tragedies, though, and people who have not emerged. And I am not an optimist. I'm a realist about this deal, and I want to move to this deal next. The second of the five old men is Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's 75. He became prime minister, I want to get this right, for the first time in 1996, and he's held all sorts of portfolios, and he's the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. He's sitting down with the president today. Now, I doubt Gadi Moses is a big Netanyahu fan. I don't know that. I'm guessing, just given his background. What do you think of Netanyahu right now and what he's done over the past 16 months since the massacre?
Look, we've talked about this. I have had a lot of criticisms of Netanyahu, of his leadership over the last 16 months, and frankly of his warfighting strategy. I think we delayed a great deal. I think he caved a lot more to Biden administration pressure than he needed to. We were frozen in Gaza for 4 months between February and May of last year. And then when we went in against the Biden administration's explicit demand that we not go into Rafah, nothing happened. In other words, the very same weakness that was shown to Iran, for example, in that administration was also shown to us. And so it was incumbent on my leader to challenge the Americans on that score when they were wrong. The war was dragged out longer than it needed to be. And Netanyahu, I'm starting with the bad stuff because I think there's something very good and important to say at the end. So just bear with me, folks. Netanyahu has led in a way that has convinced a great many Israelis that he's not a leader for this kind of war. This is stuff that's hard to see from outside. It's hard to see if you don't know Hebrew. But for example, Kibbutz Nir Oz was one of the three great massacres of October 7. And I think this is something you and I have talked about in the past. They have invited Netanyahu to visit, and it is 16 months, and he has yet to visit. I know a great many Americans, Jews and Christians, who have visited Nir Oz, and Prime Minister Netanyahu isn't willing to have that moment in front of the cameras where the greatest victims of October 7 yell at him because he was the prime minister who oversaw the policies and then oversaw the day of. So there's a politicking there. There's a cowardice there at a moment when everybody needed the exact opposite from his leadership. However, the last 4 months have seen a fundamental shift, partly because of Netanyahu, certainly approved by Netanyahu, partly because of some other hawkish people in government who have been pushing for it, in which Israel finally noticed, remembered its strength, stood up, took the war to the enemy, and fundamentally reshaped the Middle East very, very quickly. And he gets the credit at least for not screwing that up. And I don't mean that sarcastically. A leader who knows a capability his country has and doesn't stand in its way, doesn't torpedo it, doesn't undermine it with bad ideas, bad concepts, bad policy, bad leadership, is the leader you need at a time like this. And so Netanyahu deserves some of the credit, maybe a lot of the credit. And also, I think he's the exact right Israeli leader for this moment with Trump. I can't imagine somebody who actually knows this administration, Republican political culture. These are people he feels deep identification with, policy-wise, ideologically, personally. And with Ron Dermer at his side, Israel is led by genuine experts who know how to have this conversation with the Trump administration and know how to lay Israel's needs in front of the administration in convincing ways. So I have a lot of criticism of him over the last 16 months. I'm glad he's the man meeting the president right now.
So that brings us to our third older man, Donald Trump. And you're an Israeli, 43 years old. I don't know how closely you followed the decade of Trump that began with the coming down the escalator in 2015. And we've got at least 4 to 8 more years. I think the president is in excellent physical condition, so I expect he'll be not only president for 4 years, but a force in the Republican Party for longer. What do you think of him, Haviv Rettig Gur?
You know, let me give him a huge, tremendous compliment, born out of deep frustration with the administration that came before him. I think he's simple. I don't think he's dumb. Those are not the same thing. I think he's simple. I think he negotiates on fundamental things. If he comes into the region and nobody in the region knows what he's going to do, Iran genuinely doesn't know whether or not he's going to bomb their nuclear facilities. They actually don't know. They think he won't. It seems like he doesn't want to. But what happens if you insult him? Will he suddenly? That inability to predict him is an enormous asset when you're trying to force the Iranians to see reason. The fact that they don't actually know. When President Biden or President Obama would say things like, all options are on the table, nobody believed it. Nobody in America believed it. Nobody in Tehran believed it. Nobody in Israel believed it. And that's a problem. So the sophisticated kind of foreign policy elites that the Democratic Party has built out, which are so sophisticated they can't handle fundamental basic negotiation, are not so useful. We've been watching, the whole world has been watching Trump's tariff story. And what's been astonishing to watch is that it works. You start with a maximalist position and you force the other side to drag you to a place that's much closer to where you wanted to be. This is negotiation 101. This is what you need to know to be accepted into negotiation 101. It is simple and it works, and it's how humans and human minds work. And he's playing that field. And so, because he's willing to break down that sort of air of disdain and the hierarchy of prestige that is the culture on the other side, he is a much more effective president. And that's tremendously good after watching an administration that was not able to get simple things done. If you look at the border, if you look at the Middle East.
I listen to Commentary Pod every morning, and most of the times I agree with them. I disagreed with them this morning because they don't think the tariff policy achieved anything. I think it actually made Mexico and Canada reprioritize fentanyl in the border. But the most impressive thing that happened yesterday, and I want to know your reaction to this, is the pen on the Resolute desk. The Resolute desk is of great consequence to anyone who's been around since Reagan, and since it was actually given to America by Queen Victoria, I think. But the Resolute desk is big, and it was pretty empty. And he took a pen and he said, "This is Israel. The desk is the rest of the Middle East." And I don't know, but I suspect he educated a lot of people with that moment. Haviv, did you see that? Do you have a reaction to that?
I saw that. I have to tell you, that was a gratifying thing to see. If Israel pulls out of the West Bank to allow for a two-state solution, Israel shrinks down to 9 miles wide at the very middle of the country. I don't know how to put this. What would America, in the name of peace, justice, and joy for all humanity, shrink down to 9 miles wide in the middle of the country and surrounded by the countries we're surrounded by? Syria, not Canada, right? That is not to say that there shouldn't be a two-state solution. I'm making no comment whatsoever on whether or not there should be a Palestinian state in all or most of the West Bank. It's just to say that the idea that it has no costs to Israelis, the idea that Israel is somehow has this luxury of just having a completely detached conversation on abstract morality, when in fact we are talking about our absolute existential, most vital interests and questions. It was just good to see an American president who was willing to explain, brazenly and without all the verbiage and the politically correct kind of language. Guys, Israel's minuscule, and it's in a region that does not forgive weakness. And that has to be taken into account. By the way, if you don't take that into account in your dealings with Israel, you will not be successful in your dealings with Israel, because we see it, we feel it. It is fundamental to who we are. So I was really glad to see that he understood that, and he was willing to explain that to others. And again, irrespective of what policy you want to pursue.
I actually trundled 9 miles on Saturday, and I'm an old guy. It's ridiculous. I've never really grasped it until you just put it like that, but it's ridiculous. If I can trundle 9 miles on a Saturday morning, I imagine terrorists can go just as far and a lot faster. Now, Aviv, what do you think the prime minister wants from the president, and whether or not he'll get it?
That's the $64,000 question, so to speak. That is what everyone in Israel is discussing right now and trying to understand. We know that Trump doesn't want to return to a war in Gaza. We also know that Israel absolutely cannot live. And incidentally, I don't think Palestinians can live, but their politics are different, and nobody in their politics can say it out loud, with Hamas in power in Gaza. And so I think that what the Israelis are looking for are three things on three different fronts. One is a serious American effort to actually rid the Middle East of Iranian imperialism. You don't have to bomb them. You genuinely don't. They are so fragile that you can choke the Revolutionary Guard Corps to death. You can empty their budget just with massive sanctions on their oil. They took in something like $54 billion in oil exports in 2023. Almost all of that can be stopped by American sanctions. That's not something, by the way, the Biden administration back in, I believe it was early November, when they were trying to prevent an Israeli response to the October missile strike, by Iran that was potentially going to hit Iranian oil infrastructure, the Biden administration said to the Israelis, you don't have to do that. We can stop it with sanctions. And they issued sanctions on certain tanker companies, and it raised the cost of insuring those tankers, and it stopped Chinese purchasing of Iranian oil. And the Israelis are sitting there watching these sanctions. These are public statements from the Treasury. You can look up the press releases. The Israelis looked at that and said, wait a second, you had a button in Washington you could have pushed that would have cost the Revolutionary Guard Corps a huge amount of its foreign currency income, and you just sat on it. America can actually weaken this regime until it comes begging on its knees for air. And that's without dropping a bomb and landing a boot on the ground. And if the Trump administration is willing to do that, the Israelis are willing to give a great deal for that. Normalization with Saudi Arabia needs an American defense agreement of some kind with Saudi Arabia. Is it just an agreement? Is it a full-fledged treaty that has to be ratified in the Senate? That's big, that's complex. I don't know. Biden didn't have the Senate that could do so. Maybe Trump does. That would guarantee the normalization and also a tremendous, strong Sunni Israeli pro-American, backed by America alliance that stabilizes the Middle East and pushes back on all of China's allies in the Middle East, on all of Russia's allies in the Middle East. That is something the Israelis want. But the big, I wouldn't say the big thing, the politically necessary thing, and also the immediate thing, is stage two of the hostage deal. Do we begin now a negotiation for stage two in which we have American backing and American pressure on Qatar and Turkey and other patrons of Hamas to make sure that Hamas are not ruling Gaza at the end of this process? Because if they are, we're going to be back at this war. We might be back at this war in 3 or 4 or 6 weeks because the hostage deal breaks down. We might be back at this war in 4 years because Hamas is rebuilt and attacked again. There's no way to rebuild Gaza as long as Hamas is in charge. So how we navigate that question, America and Israel together, of making sure Hamas isn't in charge of Gaza, I think is most of the conversation.
There are 4 subpoints I want to cover under Trump before I move to the fourth older man. The first is weapons delivery. Now, John Podhoretz is very good on this, and I'm sure he talks to Ruthie Bloom, his sister, who lives in Jerusalem. Apparently, Team Trump greenlighted $1 billion of arms, and John said adamantly that Jake Sullivan, the former National Security Advisor, Secretary Blinken, former Secretary of State, Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden lied to the American people that the only thing they were holding up was 2,000-pound bombs. Now everything is coming in. What's your understanding about the public presentation of Team Biden to the world and to Israel about what they were and were not sending?
It's so my understanding is that there was a lot of long-running, complicated negotiation. And depending on where you understand the beginning and the end of each section of negotiation, that's how you determine sort of where everyone began and where everyone stopped. In other words, is the Biden administration pausing, but later on they release a little, but then they pause again? It's a very complex story, and the people you're talking about probably understand the details of it better than me because I have not followed the inner workings and details of that particular story. I can tell you that the Biden administration projected to the Israelis and to Israel's enemies and to Hamas that they were pressuring Israel massively and limiting the arms at their disposal. They projected to the Israelis that if they face Iran, they might not have the missile supply they might need to face down in a serious war with Iran over a long period. They projected these things into the Middle East, and it weakened Israel. Even if Israel itself was no weaker, it weakened Israel. And so the entire policy of pressuring Israel by limiting the arms supply, it did one good thing, which is that the Israeli defense industries have received brand new multi-billion shekel contracts to go out there and build indigenous missile production capabilities. So we're never again quite as dependent as we were during the Biden period. It did, it pushed Hamas away from the negotiating table. My answer to the missile question is what Anthony Blinken told the New York Times the week before he finished his term, which was, when we pressured Israel, Hamas walked away from the table. Well, of course it did. What did you think it was going to do? That's the kind of simple, obvious thing that hopefully the Trump administration won't make those kinds of simple mistakes. The Biden
Now,
administration was swimming in them, and this was one of them.
was it a mistake or was it genius for Donald Trump to say, Jordan and Egypt and other Arab countries ought to take the Gazans so that we can rebuild Gaza in a coherent. I mean, I represented developers for my quarter century as a land use lawyer. I'm retired now. And developers always think about how do we get from point A to point D, and the first thing is clear the site, demo the site, take it down. And you can't do that with people. What did you make of Donald Trump raising what is? I mean, it gave a shock to the Egyptians or Jordanians. They couldn't say no fast enough.
I don't know if it was tactical. There's a lot of debate about that, right? Was Trump being tactical? Was, again, it's the question of maximalist position. When you are conducting a negotiation, okay, and the negotiation is over something simple, the price of a product, taking an extreme position is a good idea because you have to be pulled back from that position, and the middle that you end up at is closer to your side. But if you are conducting a very large and complex negotiation where one day you have to give and the next day you're going to get, you need trust over time for that kind of complex negotiation. And maximalist positions, extreme positions, lose you that trust. And so if Trump was making an extreme position on this question, it might be a bad idea in the sense that we if whatever the United States wants to do in Gaza, it's going to need Egyptian help. And whatever the United States wants to do in Gaza, it's going to need Saudi buy-in and Jordanian buy-in and Arab world buy-in. And so to start out by saying maybe Gazans can just leave Gaza forever in some significant number, will they come back? Who knows? Might seem like a bad idea. That's part of the debate. That's part of the criticism of Trump. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is that I don't think it was a clever statement. Trump can be clever, he can do clever negotiating. I don't think this was that. I just think the man is totally immune to political correctness. He's simple. He wants to cut through all of that stuff. He wants to cut through all the moral panic, all the pearl clutching, and he just wants to have a conversation. And he wants people to explain to him why something is right or something is wrong. What the Israelis have prepared for him when they went to talk to him now, when they're visiting now, is clarity, simple, straightforward requests, simple, straightforward offers, clarity. So I think he was saying, how are we going to build Gaza? There's 2 million people in Gaza, cities that are in rubble. How are we going to build it?
He's
This is
also
something
told
that
me
I
on
talked
this
about.
show
Yeah.
last month, it's a beautiful piece of property. It should be a jewel. It should be, it should be like the French Riviera. It ought to be Monte Carlo. And we got to clear a bunch of stuff and destroy a bunch. So I really do think he's thinking like a developer there. What does the prime
It's one of the
minister
most
want?
beautiful beaches in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he looks at that as a developer and says, why don't we rebuild this? Give them purple passports, good for 2 years. They can come back after we put some street and infrastructure in, stubbed up the electrical and the utilities, and the owners can. It's not going to happen, but I'm sure that's what he's thinking. That's my guess. What does the prime minister want, do you think, regarding Lebanon and Syria?
I think Lebanon and Syria right now are on the back burner for a couple of reasons. One, the Israelis are deeply relieved that Assad no longer runs Syria. Al Julani is not a good guy. He was, he had sworn an oath of loyalty to Ayman al Zawahiri of Al Qaeda at one point a few years back. He is very much a radical Islamist. And over time, the Turks are probably going to transform his Syria into a proxy. And the Turks are ideologically pretty close to Hamas in terms of their actual version of Islam. So the current Syria is a problem, but it's a long-term problem. And Assad was allowing Iran to run Lebanon through Hezbollah, supplying Hezbollah, and that's no longer true. The Sunnis who now run Syria hate the Iranians and are going to help Israel prevent the Iranians from supplying Hezbollah and rebuilding Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Syria is now on a back burner. Lebanon is now on a back burner. There is some significant chance that Lebanon is going to be able to take care of Lebanon. And that is an astonishing and new development in the history of Lebanon. The Lebanese army has taken about 40% of the territory that the ceasefire agreement demanded of them. There are huge areas they still have not taken, won't take. That's why the Israelis are having trouble leaving. But they're finding themselves. They're finding their courage. They're finding their capability. If the United States backs the Lebanese government, if the Shia pro-Hezbollah Shia can be kept out of the new government. If certain things in Lebanon go the right way, and America can have tremendous influence there, and so can the French. then Lebanon is could be on the road to recovery, on the road to a post-Hezbollah prosperity. Right now, the Israelis think, there's so many problems. There's Iran, there's Gaza, there's the Saudi deal potentially. Lebanon, Syria is on the back burner.
All right, let me bring up the fourth older man, Ayatollah Khamenei. And I've tried repeatedly on this program to explain everything. He's a religious fanatic. He's a theocrat who believes in the end times and the hidden imam. And I've read as much as I can about Iran for as long as I can from every source that I can. Ayatollah Khamenei has been dealt blow after blow. He's 85 now, often reported to be ill, but he doesn't look ill to me, and he still looks like he's a nut, a fanatic. What do you think of him, and what does he want as he approaches the end of his days?
The Iran is one of the fastest secularizing countries in the world right now. And one reason that Iranians are losing their religion is that the regime uses that religion, is identified deeply with that religion as part of its mechanism of control. And so the Iranian people hate this regime. And Khamenei has nothing to offer them. Iran is a country of astonishing strengths, astonishing capabilities, astonishing knowledge and education. And nothing is preventing Iran from being the crown jewel of the Muslim world except this regime. They even have the natural resources to jumpstart an economy if the economy can no longer be owned and choked to death by the Revolutionary Guards and this regime. So Khamenei is a blight on his country in ways that you don't have to be Israeli and you don't have to be ideologically opposed to him. These are just numbers that you just grab from the World Bank, and you understand just how much this regime is the downfall of Iran, and for no good reason. There's no reason to face down the world and try and build nukes and break the NPT and take on sanctions and have to build out proxies in 7 different countries to destroy Israel, a country he has no border with and no interests in. That's who Khamenei is, and that's what he represents. Never mind for me, that's what he represents for Iran itself. Most Iranians know it, and one of the really interesting things is that every major uprising that we see, and we've seen over the last 12 or 13 years, has been about women's headgear. It's been about that cultural use of religion to dominate society. Khamenei knows that he is weak. A year ago, he could pretend that he wasn't. And then the Israelis remembered that they are strong. It took us a while. Our enemies forced us to, and we did. And we overflew Iranian airspace. We took out Iranian missile production capabilities. We took out Iranian air defense. Nothing could have prevented us from bombing Iranian oil infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure. Nothing could have prevented us from just bankrupting that regime in a single airstrike. And they know it. They know they are fragile. And so he is now a man who has to figure a way around the Middle East with a nation that hates him because he has brought it to its knees, and a profoundly weak and fragile regime that basically survived by everyone not understanding how weak and fragile he is. And that is his challenge, and I'm glad he faces that challenge, and I hope
But
he
Haviv,
fails.
is he a scared old man, or is he a desperate theological fanatic who wants to go out with the literal big bang? Because those are very different problem sets. And my understanding of the eschatology of Shia extremism is chaos brings the hidden imam out of the well. And so I worry about that. What do you think? Scared old man or theological fanatic with his back against the wall with running out of time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a third option, and the third option is he wants the Shia to win. And so I don't, he's not at a place where he would suicidally launch global nuclear war. And only because then the Sunni would be the last Muslim standing, right? Iran would be destroyed. He wants the Shia to win. So he will risk everything,
Oh,
and he will break everything, and he will lose everything to exterminate my people. To lead wars in Yemen that 250,000 people starved to death in 2018 from that war. He will do horrific things. He will drive genocides in Syria, but he's not going to actually lead to the destruction of Iran if he can help it. So he's absolutely a self-destructive, apocalyptic kind of leader willing to see millions die. But he does want his own revolution to survive.
okay. I want to get to the fifth old man, and he's my guy. And I've explained to the audience many times. I'm an evangelical Roman Catholic Presbyterian. Dad Presbyterian, Mom Catholic. I'm Catholic. My wife's Presbyterian. I go to both services almost every weekend. Francis is my Pope. I love John Paul the Great, St. John Paul the Great. Love St. Benedict. I have grave problems with Francis. What do you think about Pope Francis?
I feel bad commenting. I don't want to disrespect people. I'll say a couple things as a Jew that I know about Catholics. Take it for what it's worth. I can only say it with apologies. First of all, I know because I went to Rome and I toured Rome and I took a tour of the Vatican, and a priest guided our tour and told us wonderful, fascinating things that I then went and read up on. That, in fact, the whole doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope is not at all what non-Catholics think. It is the idea that the Pope, in certain ways, ex cathedra, speaks very, very rare, I think 3 times in the entire history of the church, speaks infallibly. And there are things that have to do with the status of Mary and things like that. The Pope is absolutely fallible. The Pope is absolutely human in official Catholic doctrine and dogma. And therefore, Catholics can criticize the Pope, which is, just so you know, ordinary Jews don't know that about Catholics.
Oh, really?
That's not their reputation. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
They
we can criticize the Pope a lot. Yes.
Exactly. So I'll just say, I think this Pope is playing politics and very worried about his image, and very worried about, maybe he's worried about his image because he wants the church to have a certain image. He wants relevance. Look, the European continent is a continent of empty cathedrals. It is a secularizing continent. Probably the single biggest religious force on the continent today is Islam, not Christianity, because the Christians are all atheists at this point. So the Catholic Church sits in a Rome that it less and less actually represents. Now, that's not totally true. There are many Catholics in Germany, there are many Catholics in Italy, there are many Catholics in Poland, but it is increasingly true. And faced with that crisis of faith in the West, the Pope is trying to, instead of making Catholicism relevant and making Catholicism feel more authentic by giving it its true voice, my sense as a Jew from the outside who knows very little and with tremendous apologies, he is trying to essentially run a marketing blitz, appeal to certain elements of the Western left as a way of looking, cool and modern and relevant in that way. Every single church that adopts politics as its fundamental vision, as its fundamental narrative and story, over time, within a generation, collapses.
Haviv,
and so
no apology needed. Yeah. You're quite mild in your observation. I want to get a little bit deeper. St. John Paul II was a Pole who knew what happened in Europe. Pope Benedict was a German who knew what happened in Europe. Pope Francis is an Argentine and a socialist and a Jesuit who I think very clearly does not like America at all, for reasons that I cannot fathom, but probably having to do with a warped sense of what the United States is, and has sort of the South American grudge. Do you think he's ignorant of the Middle East generally and of the world beyond Argentina?
Yeah. First of all, yes, very much. I think he's ignorant. I think, look, caring about dead children in Gaza is absolutely, as I understand Catholicism, again, as an outsider, is absolutely the role of the Pope. And there are a great many dead children in Gaza. If you think, as I do, that Hamas's numbers are total fiction, that doesn't actually mean that there aren't thousands of dead children in Gaza. And that is absolutely something that the Pope should be concerned with and thinking about and dealing with. But he makes comments about the more fundamental elements of the conflict, about the Jews and the Palestinians and about Islam, and that he seems to have a vision that thinks more in terms of sort of Marxist, kind of the Marxist theologians of South America, kind of coming out of that tradition. It's not what we have seen in the past.
And so the hardest question, do you think he's anti-Israel?
I didn't a year ago. Um, I do today. I don't know what that means, by the way, in terms of doctrine. I don't know what it means in terms of Vatican II and the Church's rethinking of its understanding of its relationship with the Jews, attempt to sort of reset a relationship with the Jews, which Pope John Paul II was very much in support of. But we haven't seen from him what we hope to see from
No, he's
him.
reversed. He
It doesn't.
reversed 20 years of
Yeah.
progress that John Paul II and Benedict made. Benedict, more than John Paul II, understood the atonement that had to be done, and Francis has undone a lot of that. And that's one of the reasons I'm primarily critical of him. But now I want to end because before we run out of time, the bigger question. I've named five old men, right? And I'm 25 years older than you, but I'm younger than those guys. In 25 years, when you're talking to the next Haviv Rettig Gur, who is 43, when you're 68, what do you expect to have happened in your crystal ball? I mean, I think it's pretty optimistic right now, but I don't want to say that because I don't live in Israel, which is 9 miles if you do the two-state solution at its narrowest.
Oh, I'm an extremely optimistic person. That is something that people accuse me of all the time. I think we have tremendous fundamental strengths, and I think that every time our enemies challenge us, they discover it to their chagrin, so to speak. I'm very optimistic about our future. Our strengths are fundamental. We have some demographic questions, educational questions, cultural questions. Israelis are becoming more conservative. Israelis are becoming more religious, mainly because the more conservative religious Israelis are having more kids. I don't know if I count as conservative religious, but I have 4 kids. That's way outside the norm of the West. But even secular left wing Israelis have more kids than every other developed nation. And so we are a strong country, an optimistic country. We have tremendous social support. This is something that you find in the data published by the UN and by sociological studies of happiness. Happiness is not a function of an easy life. Happiness is a function of a life lived with others. Strong communities, strong support, large families. Israelis have that, and no other Westerners have that. And so Israelis rank higher in happiness indices, self reported happiness, and many other measures of happiness than just about every developed nation there is. We are a country that can have the liberalism of the West accompanied by the social strengths and cultural and communal happiness of the East. We are an extraordinary thing, and our strengths, every time they are tested, are revealed. And so
Yeah,
I have no fears for the future of Israel.
good. Dan Senor has said four is the new three when it comes to babies and families in Israel. Arthur Brooks, Catholic academic happiness expert, HBS, used to run AEI, said happiness is earned success. And there's a lot of earned success in Israel, so it makes sense. At the first time I met you, it was after, or virtually met you, it was after I heard your lecture and talked with you about the Algerian model that lives in the minds of the Palestinians. That, and I want to end where I began, Gadi Moses would debate with his terrorist captors that the Israelis have been here for 4,000 years. What do you mean we're newcomers? Go back to Europe. We are here. Has a dent been made in the mythology, the misguided and often self defeating and always evil mythology of the Israel as colonialists? Has that changed in the last awful 16 months?
Yes and no. It has
Oh,
absolutely changed among most Palestinians. We measure it, we know it. It's
oh.
it's something we have asked and seen in polling. Working class Palestinians are convinced the Jews have nowhere to go. Working class Palestinians are convinced that if they think the Jews are willing to give them a state, then they are willing to accept a Jewish state. These are polls produced by Tel Aviv University, by Khalil Shikaki, a pollster, a very important pollster and sociologist on the Palestinian side, in the last 16 months. These are polls, by the way, that show terrible things. 90% of both sides think the other side wants to exterminate them. These are polls that absolutely show all the negative sides of a war. They also show that a great many ordinary Palestinians absolutely do not live in these ideological fantasies. The great problem is that Palestinian elites, the ideological elites, Fatah, Hamas, still profoundly live in these fantasies that Israel is dislodgeable, that Israel is imperialist and colonialist and apartheid and Nazi. And you cannot be both Nazi, which they call us constantly in Arabic. It doesn't play well in English, but in Arabic it's always there. You can't be both Nazi and British imperialist, and they call us both, a function of both things, right? And the reason is that all these things that they call us, all these words, it's not diagnostically that they say we're literally colonialist, apartheid, imperialist, Nazi. It's that every single one of these words are peelable. They're removable. The Nazis were removed out of Germany. The apartheid was removed off South Africa. The colonialism was removed off Algeria. And they argue that we are dislodgeable in that way. We are not dislodgeable in that way. We have nowhere to go. Half of us would go back to Yemen and Baghdad and Morocco. Nobody in Baghdad is taking them back. And the elites are still stuck there. And ordinary Palestinians know that it isn't true, but there is no other story in the Palestinian national movement. There's no other politics that they could engage in. So there's a great tragedy among the Palestinians in that regard. They are trapped by these elite narratives in endless war that they cannot win, that cannot succeed, that can only destroy things for them.
Very last question. Do Israelis understand that and have any sympathy for people trapped by their elites in an absurdist reality that is not true and never can be true?
When I give a talk to Israelis on exactly this point, going through the history of the Palestinian political and strategic discourse about us for 140 years, they come out of it with that sympathy. In other words, they understand that there is this profound internal trap that Palestinians are in their conversation about us. And a lot of it has to do with Islamist kinds of rhetoric and ideology, that if the Jews can push back Islam, that's a catastrophic theological disaster. And they're trapped for reasons of deep ideology that goes back a long way, but they're trapped in these elites having these fantasies about removing us that are impossible. We certainly can't let it happen, but also they don't have the capacity to do it. So they do come out with that sympathy. But generally, there's very little sympathy. I'll tell you, Hamas did everything it could on October 7, and everything it could in the suicide bombings in 96, that were the first time the left lost the election to Netanyahu, and everything they could in the Second Intifada, 140 suicide bombings. Hugh, imagine 140 suicide bombings by illegal migrants in the US right now. How would that change the immigration debate? 140 suicide bombings of the Second Intifada. Hamas convinced Israelis that they want to exterminate us. And that sucks all the air out of the room. It's awfully hard to feel sympathy for a national cause that you believe defines itself, because every time it opens its mouth and speaks to you, tells you explicitly, constantly, every day, that it's there to exterminate you. There is nothing, maybe my main last point, there is nothing that the supporters of the Palestinians can do in the West, that they can do for Gazans, for the Palestinians, that Hamas won't undo the next time it opens its mouth and tells Israelis it's coming to murder them. And so Israelis, I think, themselves, in a sense, are trapped in Palestinian discourse, in Palestinian rhetoric. It's awfully hard to reach across the aisle when that's the only thing you hear from Palestinian politics.
I will leave it there. Haviv, thank you for being generous with your time. It's an important day in U.S.-Israeli relations, and I'm glad you could spend this much time with us. As much of it as possible will be on the program today, the rest in the podcast and on YouTube. I appreciate it, Haviv. Talk to you again soon, and thank you for your time.